She had fed every soul on that prairie, yet not one of them ever looked at her twice. Until the day the richest rancher in the territory walked through her door and asked for the one thing nobody had ever wanted from her. Her. Not her bread. Not her stew. Her. Winona Hale spent her whole life believing a woman built like her didn't get to be chosen. Silas Crow was about to prove every single person in that town wrong, including her. Stay with me to the end, hit that like button, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Winona Hale had flour on her hands before the sun even cleared the flat line of the horizon. It was always that way. Before the rooster, before the first wagon creaked down the road toward town, before anybody else in Larkspur Hollow had so much as rolled over in bed, she was already up, already working, already disappearing into the one place where nobody could see her face and judge it. The kitchen didn't care what she looked like. The oven didn't flinch when she leaned in close to check the bread. The dough didn't go quiet and awkward the way people did when she walked into a room. Flour just settled on her arms and her apron and the backs of her hands like it belonged there, like it had decided a long time ago that this was where it was supposed to be. She liked that about flour. It never made her feel like she was taking up too much space. Morning's near, she muttered to herself, sliding a tray of biscuits into the oven and shutting the door with her hip. Best get moving. Talking to herself wasn't a habit she was proud of, but there wasn't anybody else in that small house to talk to. There hadn't been in a long while. Her mother had passed 4 winters back, coughing into a handkerchief until the coughing just stopped one night and didn't start again. Her father had gone years before that, swallowed up by a horse that spooked at nothing and threw him into a fence post. So it was just Winona and the kitchen, and the bread she sold to whoever wandered through Larkspur Hollow needing a meal and a kind word. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at herself for half a second in the cracked little mirror by the door. Big woman. Tired eyes. Hair that never wanted to stay pinned the way she pinned it. Don't start, she told her reflection, and turned away before it could say anything back. By the time the sun was properly up, she had 4 loaves cooling on the windowsill and a pot of coffee going for the early travelers, who sometimes stopped at her place before continuing on toward Abilene or wherever else they were headed. She didn't run an official inn, just a house with a sign out front that said bread, coffee, pie, hand-painted by her own unsteady fingers, and a reputation that had slowly built itself up over years of nobody going hungry near her door. The bell on the porch rail jingled. She looked up, expecting one of the Tanner boys come to buy bread for their mother, or maybe old Pruitt looking for pie he wouldn't pay full price for. It wasn't either of them. It was Silas Crow. Winona's stomach did something complicated and uncomfortable, the kind of thing it always did whenever someone important walked anywhere near her. Silas Crow wasn't just anybody. He owned the biggest spread of land for 30 miles in any direction, ran more cattle than any 3 other ranchers combined, and had a reputation for being fair, hardworking, and about as easy to read as a rock. People respected him. People also kept a careful distance from him, the way folks do with anybody who's got that much weight behind their name. He stood in her doorway looking like he hadn't slept much, hat in his hands, dust on his boots from riding hard. "Morning, ma'am," he said. Winona straightened up fast, brushing flour off her apron like that would somehow fix anything about how she looked. "Morning, Mr. Crow. Can I get you something? Coffee's fresh." "Obliged." He stepped inside, glancing around the small kitchen like he was sizing up more than just the room. "Smells good in here." "Bread does that," she said, pouring him a cup with hands that weren't quite steady. She set it on the counter rather than handing it to him directly, because handing it to him directly would mean getting closer, and getting closer to a man like Silas Crow wasn't something she knew how to do without her whole body going stiff with embarrassment. He took a sip, nodded once like he approved, and then just stood there for a second too long, like he was working up to something. "I'll get right to it," he said finally. "I've got a problem out at the ranch, and I think you might be the answer to it." Winona blinked. "Me? My cook took sick 3 days back. Real sick. Doc says it'll be weeks before she's back on her feet if she comes back at all. And I've got 11 men out there who can rope a steer better than anybody in the territory, but couldn't fry an egg if their lives depended on it." He turned the cup slowly in his hands. "I need somebody who can feed a crew that size every day. Good food. And I've heard your name mentioned more than once around town. Folks say nobody bakes bread like Winona Hale. She felt heat crawl up her neck, and not the good kind. That's kind of folks to say, but Mr. Crow, I don't think I'll pay fair wages, he said, like he expected money to be the holdup. Room and board on top of it. You'd have your own space, wouldn't have to share with the hands, obviously. It ain't the money, she said quickly, then stopped herself because she hadn't meant to say even that much. He waited. He had a way of waiting that made a person feel like he genuinely wanted to hear the rest of the sentence instead of just being polite about it. Winona looked down at the counter, at the flour dusted across the wood grain, at anything that wasn't his face. Your ranch, she said carefully, is the biggest one around. Everybody who works there, everybody who comes through there, they're going to look at me and wonder why on God's green earth you hired a woman who looks like I do to stand in your kitchen. There. She'd said it. Out loud to his face, the thing she usually only said to herself in that cracked little mirror. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't look away either, the way most people did when she brought up her size, like the subject itself was something shameful that needed to be avoided. I didn't come here looking for somebody pretty, he said plainly. I came here looking for somebody who can cook food that'll put strength back into 11 exhausted men and maybe, while she's at it, remind them there's still some decency left in the world. I don't much care what that person looks like. I care whether the food's good and whether the person serving it has got some heart behind it. Winona's eyes stung, sudden and unwelcome, and she had to look hard at the coffee pot to keep from embarrassing herself further. You don't know me well enough to say I've got heart, she said, quieter now. No, he agreed. But I know your bread. And bread like that don't come from somebody who's just going through the motions. Somebody who bakes like you bake is thinking about the folks who are going to eat it. That's heart, far as I'm concerned. Rest of it, we'll figure out as we go. She didn't have an answer for that. Nobody had ever talked to her like her cooking was proof of something good inside her. Like the bread itself was a window into who she was instead of just something to fill a belly. People complimented her food plenty. Nobody had ever connected it to her character before. Not like that. Not so directly. I'll need to think on it, she said, because saying yes outright felt like jumping off something tall without checking how far down the ground was. Fair enough. He set his empty cup down. I'll be at the ranch the rest of the day. Crowland, north of town, can't miss it. You decide you want the work? You come on out, and we'll get you settled. He put his hat back on and turned for the door, then paused with one hand on the frame. For what it's worth, he said, not looking back at her, I think you'd be doing my men a kindness they don't even know they need yet. Then he was gone, boots thudding down the porch steps, and Winona stood alone in her kitchen with her heart pounding harder than it had any business pounding over a job offer. She spent the rest of that morning baking without really thinking about what she was baking, her hands moving on instinct while her mind chewed over everything Silas Crow had said. By noon, she'd made 3 more loaves than she needed and burned one of them clean through because she'd forgotten it in the oven entirely. Stupid, she muttered, scraping the ruined loaf into the slop bucket for the hogs. Can't even think straight. The thing was, she wanted to go. That scared her more than anything. She wanted to walk out to that ranch and prove that her hands could do something useful for a place that big, that important. But wanting something and being foolish enough to reach for it were two very different animals, and Winona had spent 28 years learning the difference the hard way. She remembered being 16 standing outside the schoolhouse dance, watching the other girls twirl around in dresses that fit them the way dresses were supposed to fit, while she stood off to the side because nobody had asked her, and she hadn't dared ask anybody either. She remembered being 22, overhearing 2 ranch hands laughing about Big Winona and what kind of man would ever have to settle for a woman shaped like a barrel. She remembered every single unkind word, filed away neat and orderly in some back room of her mind, ready to be pulled out any time she got the notion that maybe she deserved something good. By late afternoon, she'd made up her mind twice and unmade it twice more. It was the thought of those 11 hungry men, real people, with real stomachs and nobody competent feeding them, that finally tipped her over. Whatever fear she carried about her own worth, she knew good and well that fear didn't put food on a table. Skill did. Work did. And she had both of those things in spades, whatever else she lacked. She packed a single bag with what little she owned worth bringing, left a note for the Tanner boy to keep an eye on her house, and walked the 2 miles north to Crowland with her chin up and her stomach absolutely churning. The ranch came into view before she expected it to. A a sprawling collection of barns and corrals, and a long bunkhouse, with the main house sitting up on a small rise like it was keeping watch over everything below it. Cattle dotted the pastures in every direction, more cattle than Winona had ever seen gathered in one place in her whole life. A few of the hands noticed her walking up the road and stopped what they were doing to stare. She felt their eyes on her the way she always felt eyes on her, heavy and uncomfortable, and she made herself keep walking instead of turning straight back around. "You looking for somebody?" one of them called out. Younger fellow, maybe 19, with a grin that wasn't unkind but wasn't entirely respectful either. "Mr. Crow," she said. "He's expecting me." The young man's eyebrows went up, like that was the last answer he expected, but he just shrugged and pointed toward the main house. "Up there. Tell him Bo says he still owes me for that bet on the cards." Winona walked the rest of the way up the rise with her bag clutched tight in one hand, very aware of the fact that more hands had stopped to watch her by now, maybe 6 or 7 of them. None of them saying anything outright cruel, but all of them clearly wondering what business a woman built like her had walking up to the boss's front door. Silas met her on the porch before she even had a chance to knock. He must have seen her coming from the window. "You came," he said, and there was something almost like relief in his voice. "Said I'd think on it," Winona answered, lifting her chin a little. "Thought on it. Here I am." "Glad to hear it." He stepped aside to let her up onto the porch. "Kitchen's through the back. I'll show you where everything is, what supplies we've got, all that. Fair warning, my last cook kept things organized her own particular way, so you might want to set it up different to suit yourself." "I generally do things my own way regardless," Winona said, and immediately wondered if that sounded too sharp, too forward for a woman who'd just been hired not even 5 minutes prior. But Silas just gave a short laugh, surprised and genuine. "Good. I'd rather have somebody with opinions about how a kitchen ought to run than somebody who just does whatever they're told without thinking on it." He led her through the house, which was bigger and plainer than she expected. Sturdy furniture, no decoration to speak of beyond a few framed photographs and a rifle mounted over the fireplace. The kind of house built by a man who cared more about function than appearance. The kitchen at the back was large, larger than anything Winona had ever cooked in, with a long work table and a stove big enough to handle 3 pots at once, and shelves stocked with more flour and beans and salted meat than she'd seen outside a general store. "Lord," she breathed, before catching herself and clamping her mouth shut, embarrassed at how much wonder had leaked into her voice. "Big operation needs a big kitchen," Silas said simply. "You'll find everything you need. If you don't, you tell me, and I'll get it." "This is more than enough," Winona said, running her hand along the edge of the work table like she was making sure it was real. "More than enough." He watched her for a moment, something unreadable in his expression, and then nodded toward a small door off to the side. "That's your room. Not much, but it's private, and it's yours. Nobody bothers you in there." Winona looked at the door, then back at him. "You really mean that?" "Nobody bothers me." Something shifted in his face, just slightly, like he understood exactly what she was really asking. "Anybody gives you trouble on my land, ma'am, you come tell me directly. I don't tolerate disrespect toward the people who work for me. Don't matter if it's a hand who's been here 10 years or somebody who started this morning. Everybody gets treated decent under my roof, or they don't stay under my roof." It was a small thing, maybe, the kind of promise plenty of bosses made and plenty of bosses broke the first chance they got. But something in the flat, certain way he said it, made Winona believe him anyway. "Supper's usually around 6, he continued, all business again. "Men come in from the fields hungry enough to eat the table itself, so don't be shy about portions. Breakfast's early, before sunup most days. You'll get used to the rhythm of it quick enough." "I'm used to early mornings," Winona said. "Lived my whole life by 'em." "Figured as much." He glanced toward the window, where the afternoon light was starting to slant low and gold across the yard. "I'll leave you to get settled. Anything you need, you ask." "I mean that." He left her alone in that enormous kitchen, and Winona stood there for a long moment just breathing it in. The smell of dust and wood smoke and dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the weight of an entirely new life pressing down on her shoulders. She thought about turning right back around and walking home. Instead, she set her bag down, rolled up her sleeves, and started looking through the shelves to see what she had to work with for supper. Berkut. By 5:30 that evening, the kitchen smelled like something worth coming home to. Winona had found enough in the pantry to put together a thick beef stew, a pan of cornbread, and the start of what she hoped would be a decent apple pie if the apples held up. She moved through the unfamiliar space the way she moved through her own kitchen back home. Quick, sure, like her hands knew exactly what they were doing even when her mind was a tangled mess of nerves. The first hand started filtering in around 6, loud and dusty and smelling like horse and hard work, and every single one of them stopped dead in the doorway when they saw her standing at the stove instead of the woman they were used to. "Where's May?" one of them asked, a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache and a voice like gravel. "May took sick," Winona said, not turning around from the stew. "I'm filling in." A heavy silence settled over the room. She could feel them all looking at her, sizing her up, and she made herself keep stirring like none of it bothered her, even though every inch of her wanted to shrink down small enough to disappear. "Boss hired her himself?" another voice asked, skeptical. "He did." Somebody snorted, quiet but not quiet enough. "Well, hell, guess Crow figures we need somebody big enough to match the portions." A few of them laughed at that, low and ugly, the kind of laugh that wasn't really about humor at all. Winona's face burned, but she kept her back to them and her hands moving, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "Y'all gonna eat, or you gonna stand there flapping your jaws?" she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. "Stew's getting cold either way, and I ain't reheating it twice for grown men who can't make up their minds." There was a beat of silence, and then somebody, she'd learn later his name was Tucker, one of the older hands, let out a short, surprised laugh. "Got some bite to her, this one." "Sit down and eat," Winona said, ladling stew into the first bowl with more force than strictly necessary. "Talk all you want after your bellies are full. Might improve your manners some." They sat. They ate. And by the time bowls were being scraped clean and seconds were being requested, the mockery from the doorway had quieted into something closer to grudging surprise. Silas came in last, taking his seat at the head of the long table without any particular ceremony, just another tired man at the end of a long day. He tasted the stew, and Winona watched him out of the corner of her eye, holding her breath without meaning to. "This is good," he said, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Real good." A few of the hands murmured agreement, mouths still full. Winona felt something loosen in her chest, just slightly, the first easy breath she'd taken since walking through that front gate. It wasn't a victory, not really. There would be harder days ahead, she knew that much already from the look some of those men had given her. But for one evening, in one kitchen, on land that didn't belong to her and never would, Winona Hale had fed 11 hungry men a meal that mattered, and not one of them had gone to bed with an empty stomach. For now, that was enough to hold on to. She cleaned up alone after the men dispersed toward the bunkhouse, scrubbing pots in water gone lukewarm, and didn't notice Silas standing in the doorway until he spoke. "They'll come around," he said. "Tucker laughing's a good sign. Man doesn't laugh easy." Winona kept scrubbing. "Some of them won't. Some folks decide what they think about a person before that person's even said a word, and nothing changes their mind after that." "Maybe," Silas allowed, "but you handled yourself fine in there. Didn't shrink, didn't apologize for existing. That's more than I expected from somebody's first night." She finally looked at him, drying her hands on her apron. "You expected me to apologize for existing?" Something flickered across his face. Regret, maybe, or just honesty he hadn't meant to say out loud. "I expected the world's already made you feel like you ought to. Most folks who carry that kind of weight on them, they walk into a room already half bent over, waiting to be told they don't belong there." Winona didn't have an answer for that, because it was true, and hearing somebody else say it plainly, without cruelty, without pity, knocked something loose in her chest she wasn't ready to examine too closely. "Good night, Mr. Crow," she said instead, turning back to the pots. "Good night, Miss Hale," he answered, and left her alone with the dishes and the quiet and the strange, unfamiliar feeling that maybe, just maybe, she'd landed somewhere she might actually be allowed to stay. The days at Crow Ranch fell into a rhythm faster than Winona expected, though rhythm didn't mean ease. Mornings began before the sky had any color in it at all, just a thin gray line over the eastern pastures while she stood in that enormous kitchen mixing biscuit dough by lamplight, her breath fogging in the cold before the stove warmed the room through. She'd learned the men's habits quick. Tucker took his coffee black and complained if it wasn't strong enough to stand a spoon in. Bo, the young one who'd pointed her toward the house that first day, ate like he hadn't seen food in a week no matter how much she gave him. Big Russ, quiet as a fence post most mornings, always thanked her plain and simple, no fuss, and somehow that small kindness meant more to her than anything else said at that table. Then there was the other kind. "Careful, boys, don't get too close. Might tip the table over if she leans in," somebody muttered one morning, not quite low enough, and a ripple of laughter followed it down the bench. Winona kept ladling gravy over biscuits like she hadn't heard a word, though her jaw had gone tight enough to ache. She'd learned that much in 28 years. React, and they'd circle back for more, hungry for the reaction itself more than anything. Stay still, stay steady, and most of the meanness eventually ran out of places to land. Most of it, not all of it. "You hear me, ma'am?" The same voice pressed. A hand named Dell, lanky and sharp-faced, the kind of man who seemed to need an audience for everything he said. "Said you might tip the table." "Heard you fine," Winona said, setting the gravy boat down with more force than it needed. "Heard you weren't half so funny as you think you are either, but I let that one go too." A few of the men laughed at that, real laughter this time, and Dell's face went a blotchy red that told Winona she'd landed the hit even if she hadn't meant to throw quite that hard. "Just having some fun," he muttered, looking down at his plate. "Fun's better when everybody's laughing," Winona said, quieter now. "Not just the ones doing the laughing at somebody else's expense." She didn't wait to see how that settled with him. She turned back to the stove, hands busy with the next pan, heart hammering harder than she let her face show. It wasn't easy standing up like that, not for a woman who'd spent most of her life making herself smaller in rooms exactly like that one. But something about Crowland, about the particular quality of the work and the way Silas had looked at her that first night and told her not to apologize for existing, had put a little iron in her spine that hadn't been there before. She noticed Silas hadn't said a word through any of it, sitting at the head of the table with his coffee, watching the whole exchange over the rim of his cup. When the men finally cleared out toward the morning's work, he lingered a moment longer than usual. "You didn't need my help in there," he said. "Didn't ask for it," Winona answered, scraping the skillet clean. "No," he agreed, something almost like a smile pulling at one corner of his mouth. "You didn't." He left for the fields without saying anything more, and Winona stood there a moment, oddly warmed by the fact that he hadn't swooped in to rescue her, hadn't treated her like she needed rescuing in the first place. It was a small thing. It mattered more than it should have. The weeks rolled forward, each one easier than the last in some ways, harder in others. The cooking itself, Winona could have done in her sleep. She knew how to stretch a side of beef into 3 different meals, how to make beans taste like more than just beans, how to coax flavor out of whatever the pantry happened to offer that week. The ranch hands' stomachs, at least, had stopped being a battlefield. Stew gave way to roasted meat, gave way to thick chowders on the cold mornings, and slowly, the grumbling around the table turned into something closer to anticipation. "What's cooking smell so good for?" Bo asked one evening, practically vibrating with hunger as he hung his hat by the door. "Apple pie," Winona said. "If you boys finish your chores before it cools, you might get a slice before bed." "I'll finish chores for a week straight if it means pie," Bo said, already heading back out the door at a near run, and Winona found herself smiling at his back. A real smile, not the careful, guarded kind she usually wore around the men. It was strange how much she'd started to look forward to those evenings. Not because anybody had stopped noticing her size, they hadn't, not really. The occasional comment still slipped out, usually from Dell or one of his friends, usually quieter now, but never quite gone. But somewhere in the last few weeks, the meanness had stopped being the loudest thing in the room. The food had taken over that space instead. The gratitude. The simple, uncomplicated pleasure of a full belly after a long day's work. Tucker started bringing her wildflowers some mornings, sat quiet on the kitchen windowsill without a word, gruff old cowboy too proud to say anything sentimental about it, but clearly wanting her to know the stew the night before had meant something to him. Russ started fixing things around the kitchen without being asked. A loose hinge on the pantry door, a wobbly table leg. Small repairs that told her, in his own quiet language, that he saw her as somebody worth the trouble. It wasn't everybody. It wasn't even most of them. Not all the way. But it was enough that Winona started to feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like she belonged somewhere. She just couldn't quite believe it yet. Not all the way down. There was still a voice in the back of her mind, old and familiar, that kept whispering this wouldn't last, that something would happen to remind everybody, including her, exactly why a woman shaped like her didn't get to have nice things like belonging. So, Silas noticed more than he let on. That much became clear to Winona slowly, in small, accumulated moments, rather than any single dramatic revelation. He started finding reasons to be in the kitchen that didn't quite hold up to scrutiny. A question about supplies that could have waited. A comment about the bread that didn't need saying out loud. He'd lean against the doorframe sometimes in the evening, after the men had cleared out, just talking. About the ranch, about the cattle prices, about nothing in particular, while Winona finished cleaning up. "You don't have to keep me company while I do dishes," she told him one night, only half meaning it as a complaint. "Don't mind it," Silas said, watching her scrub a pot with more attention than the task probably deserved. "Quiet of the house gets to a man after a while. Nice having somebody to talk at, even if she's mostly just telling me to hand her the next plate." "Hand me the next plate," Winona said, deadpan, and he laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and handed her the plate. It became a habit, those quiet evenings. Winona found herself looking forward to them in a way that scared her a little. The way she found herself paying closer attention to small details about him she had no business noticing. The way he rolled his sleeves up past his elbows when he worked, the particular furrow that appeared between his eyebrows when he was thinking hard about something, the way his voice gentled whenever he talked about the land. Like the ranch itself was something he loved the way other men loved a person. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked him one evening, drying a stack of bowls. "Going somewhere easier?" Silas considered the question like it deserved real thought. "No, don't reckon I have. My father built this place out of nothing but stubbornness and bad luck, mostly. Lost 2 herds to drought before I was even born. Lost my mother the same year I was born, matter of fact. By all rights, this ranch shouldn't exist. But he kept at it, and I kept at it after him. And now it's about the only thing in this world that's purely mine. Don't see much reason to walk away from that, easier or not." "That's a hard way to grow up," Winona said quietly. "Losing your mother that young." "Was," Silas agreed, simple as that, no self-pity in it. "Made me understand early on that this world don't owe anybody softness. You want something good in it, you build it yourself, brick by brick, day by day. Nobody's handing it to you." Winona thought about that long after he'd gone to bed, lying awake in her small room off the kitchen, listening to the wind move through the pastures outside. She understood that kind of thinking better than she wanted to admit. She'd built her own small life the same way, brick by brick, loaf by loaf, never expecting anybody to hand her anything, because nobody ever had. Maybe that was part of why she couldn't quite trust what was happening at Crow Ranch. Good things weren't supposed to arrive without a cost. She kept waiting for the cost to show itself. The trouble when it came from Dell. It started small, the way trouble usually did. A snide comment here, a comment there. Nothing Winona couldn't shrug off on its own. But Dell had a way of needing an audience, and over the weeks he'd gathered a small handful of hands who laughed along whenever he got going, emboldened by each other in a way that made the meanness sharper than it might have been from any one of them alone. It came to a head on a Thursday evening, hot and dusty, tempers short after a long day moving cattle in the heat. Winona had supper ready right on time, same as always, but Dell came in late, sweaty and irritable, and took one look at the portion she'd set out and scowled. "That all I'm getting?" he said. "Same as everybody else," Winona answered, already turning to the next plate. "Don't look like the same as everybody else," Dell pressed, voice rising just enough to draw attention from the rest of the table. "Looks like you kept the bigger portion for yourself, way you usually do." The room went quiet. Winona felt her face go hot, the old familiar shame crawling up her neck, and for a second she just stood there, ladle in hand, unsure whether to respond or let it pass like she usually did. "That's enough, Dell," Tucker said from down the table, gruff. "I'm just saying what everybody's thinking," Dell pushed on, emboldened. "Woman her size, cooking for a whole ranch, makes a man wonder where half the food's actually going." A couple of the newer hands snickered. Most of the table had gone uncomfortably silent, eyes on their plates, nobody quite brave enough to speak up, but nobody quite willing to laugh along either. Winona set the ladle down very carefully because her hands had started to shake and she didn't trust herself not to drop it. "I think," she said, voice tight but level, "you ought to watch your mouth at my table." "Your table?" Dell laughed. Ugly. "Last I checked, this was Crow's table. You're just standing at the stove." That was when the door opened and Silas walked in, late from checking a fence line, dust still on his hat, and the room's whole temperature changed in an instant. Dell's mouth snapped shut. Silas looked around the silent table, at Winona standing rigid by the stove, at the men avoiding eye contact, and something in his face went hard and still in a way Winona hadn't seen before. "Somebody want to tell me what I walked in on?" he said. Nobody answered. Dell suddenly found his plate very interesting. "Dell," Silas said, quiet, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. "I asked a question." "Wasn't nothing, boss," Dell muttered. "Just talking." "Talking about what?" The silence stretched long enough that Winona finally answered for him, because she'd rather say it herself than let it sit there festering. "He was saying I keep more food for myself than I give the men, on account of my size." She watched something shift across Silas's face. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation of a suspicion he'd been carrying for a while. "That true, Dell?" "It was a joke," Dell said, weaker now. "Didn't sound much like a joke to me," Silas said. He walked further into the room, slow and deliberate, and stopped at the head of the table. "I told every man on this ranch when I hired Miss Hale that she'd be treated with the same respect as anybody else who works this land. Seems that message didn't reach everybody." "Boss, it was just—" "I'm not finished," Silas said, and Dell shut his mouth fast. The whole table sat frozen, forks still, nobody moving, and Winona found herself almost feeling sorry for Dell despite everything, the way the air had gone thick and dangerous around him. "This woman gets up before any of you," Silas said, voice carrying clear and even across the room. "Cooks 3 meals a day for 11 grown men who eat like they're trying to empty the whole pantry in one sitting. Does it without complaint, without ever once asking for anything more than what's fair, and in return, she gets mocked at her own table by men who couldn't survive a week doing what she does every single day." He let that sit a moment. "Anybody else feel the way Dell does? I want to hear it now, out loud, because I'd rather know who I'm dealing with than have it whispered behind my back." Nobody said a word. A few of the men actually looked ashamed, glancing toward Winona like they were seeing her properly for the first time. "Dell," Silas continued, "you'll apologize to Miss Hale, right now, in front of everybody who heard you disrespect her." Dell's jaw tightened, pride warring visibly with the realization that he had no real choice in the matter. He looked at Winona, and for a moment she thought he might actually refuse, might rather lose his job than back down in front of the other men. "Sorry," he said finally, gruff and clearly uncomfortable, but real enough underneath it. "Shouldn't have said it." "No," Winona said quietly. "You shouldn't have." She didn't say it to twist the knife. She said it because it was true, and because some small, stubborn part of her refused to let the apology smooth everything over too easily, like the words alone could erase the sting that still sat hot in her chest. Silas nodded once, like the matter was settled, and took a seat at the table. "Eat," he said to the room at large. "Food's getting cold, and I imagine Miss Hale worked too hard on it for it to go to waste over foolishness." The meal continued, quieter than usual, but something had shifted in the room. A line had been drawn, clear and unmistakable, and every man at that table understood now exactly where Silas Crow stood. Later, after the dishes were done and the kitchen had gone quiet, Winona found Silas sitting alone on the porch steps, looking out over the dark pastures. "You didn't have to do that," she said, settling carefully onto the step beside him, the wood creaking under her weight in a way that used to make her wince, but tonight she barely noticed. "Had every reason to do it," Silas said. "Man disrespects somebody under my roof, that's my business to settle. Always has been." "Still," Winona said, "most men wouldn't bother. Easier to let it slide, keep the peace." "Easier ain't always right," Silas said simply. He glanced at her, the moonlight catching the side of his face. "You've been carrying that kind of talk your whole life, haven't you? Folks looking at you, deciding what kind of person you are before they've even bothered to know you." Winona looked down at her hands, rough from years of work, flour permanently worked into the creases of her knuckles. Long as I can remember, she admitted. You get used to it, or you tell yourself you do anyway. Don't think a person ever really gets used to that, Silas said. Just learns how to carry it without it showing as much. She looked at him, surprised by how exactly he'd named the thing she'd never quite been able to put into words herself. How would you know that? He was quiet a moment, like he was deciding whether to say more. Lost my mother same day I was born, like I told you. Folks around here used to whisper about that too, when I was a boy. Said it was bad luck, having a child cost his mother her life like that. Said I was marked somehow. He shrugged, but it wasn't an easy gesture. Don't carry the same weight you carry, not the same kind of unkindness. But I know what it is to walk into a room and feel everybody already decided something about you before you said a word. Winona didn't know what to say to that. She hadn't expected him to offer something so raw, so unguarded, sitting there in the dark with the crickets going and the cattle settling somewhere out in the pasture. I'm sorry, she said quietly. That's an awful thing for folks to put on a child. Was a long time ago, Silas said. Don't think on it much anymore. Mostly. They sat in silence for a while after that, comfortable in a way Winona hadn't expected silence with another person to feel. The night was warm, full of the particular smell of dust and grass and distant rain that hung over the prairie most summer evenings, and for a moment, just a moment, Winona let herself believe that maybe she really had landed somewhere worth staying. Thank you, she said eventually, for tonight, for all of it really, hiring me when nobody else would have bothered, standing up for me at that table. Wasn't charity, Silas said, turning to look at her directly. Want to be real clear about that. I didn't hire you out of pity, and I didn't stand up for you tonight because I felt sorry for you. I did both those things because you earned them. Your cooking earned you this job. Your character earned you that table's respect, even from men too thick-headed to show it proper. You don't know my character all that well yet, Winona said, though something in her chest had gone warm and unsteady at his words. Know enough, Silas said. Know you work harder than anybody else on this ranch and never once complain about it. Know you stood your ground against Dell before I even walked through that door, and you didn't need rescuing, not really. I just didn't care for the man saying it twice. Winona laughed, soft and surprised, the sound unfamiliar in her own throat. Suppose that's true. Generally is, Silas said, the corner of his mouth lifting again in that almost smile she'd started to notice more and more. They sat together a while longer, talking about nothing important, the kind of easy conversation that filled up the space between two people slowly getting used to each other's company. And though neither of them said it out loud, though neither of them would have dared put a name to whatever was settling quietly into the space between them on that porch step, something had shifted that night. Something neither of them was quite ready to look at directly. But both of them felt all the same, sitting there under a sky thick with stars, the ranch breathing quiet around them, and the whole frontier holding its breath for whatever was coming next. The sky started turning strange around mid-afternoon, 3 weeks after that night on the porch steps, and Winona noticed it before anybody said a word about it. She'd stepped outside to shake out a rug, and something about the color of the air stopped her cold. A sick greenish cast low on the western horizon, the clouds piling up fast and wrong, moving in a way clouds didn't usually move. The wind had gone still in that particular way that wasn't really stillness at all, more like the whole prairie was holding its breath. Russ, she called toward the barn, where he was mending tack. Russ, you see that sky? Russ straightened up, shaded his eyes, and went quiet for a long moment. That ain't good, he said finally. That ain't good at all. By the time Silas came riding in from the north pasture 20 minutes later, the wind had picked up sharp and sudden, kicking dust across the yard in stinging gusts, and the temperature had dropped enough that Winona felt goosebumps rise on her arms despite the heat of the day before. Storm's coming in fast, Silas said, swinging down off his horse, already shouting orders before his boots hit the ground. Get the herd into the lower pasture. Get the gates secured. I want every loose thing on this property tied down or brought inside in the next half hour. The ranch exploded into motion. Hands ran in every direction, securing what they could, driving cattle toward whatever shelter the land offered. Winona found herself swept up in it without really deciding to be, hauling buckets and tools into the barn, helping Tucker drag a wagon under the lean-to before the wind got bad enough to send it tumbling. Get inside, Miss Hale, Silas told her, riding past with his hat pulled low. Storm like this, you don't want to be caught out in it. What about you? She shouted over the rising wind. Got cattle to see to, he called back and was gone before she could argue. The storm hit full force just after 5, and it hit like nothing Winona had ever witnessed in her life. The wind came first, a wall of it, screaming across the open prairie with a sound like something alive and furious. Rain followed hard behind, driving sideways, and somewhere in the chaos the sky split open with lightning that lit the whole yard white for half a second at a time, followed by thunder that shook the windows in their frames. Winona stood at the kitchen window, watching the world outside dissolve into gray and silver violence, her heart pounding with a fear she couldn't quite name. The men were still out there. Silas was still out there. She lost track of time standing at that window. 10 minutes? Maybe 20? Watching shapes move through the rain. Men and horses, barely visible, fighting to keep the herd together against a wind that seemed determined to scatter everything it touched. Then she heard it. A crack, sharp and different from the thunder, followed by shouting, and through the rain-streaked glass she saw a section of the old barn, the one used for younger stock, calves too small to weather the storm in open pasture, buckle inward like something had punched straight through its side. Winona didn't think. She grabbed a coat off the hook by the door and ran out into the storm before any part of her brain caught up to what her body was doing. The rain hit her like a physical blow, cold and furious, soaking her through in seconds. She fought her way across the yard toward the barn, wind shoving against her with enough force to nearly knock her flat, and found Silas already there, along with Tucker and Bo, all 3 of them hauling at a section of collapsed roof that had pinned part of the structure down. There's a calf trapped in there, Bo was shouting, voice barely carrying over the storm. Heard it crying not 2 minutes ago. Get back! Silas roared at Winona when he spotted her. This ain't safe. Get back to the house. I'm not leaving you out here alone, much such, Winona shouted back, already grabbing hold of a section of broken board, helping haul it aside despite Silas's protest. There wasn't time to argue further. The barn groaned again, an awful sound, timber straining against itself, and Silas made a decision in the space of a heartbeat. He ducked under the collapsed section into the dark, narrow gap that had opened up where the wall had caved. Silas! Winona screamed, the wind nearly tearing his name right out of her mouth. Stay there, his voice came back muffled from somewhere inside the wreckage. I see it. I've got it. Just give me a second. The barn groaned louder. Tucker grabbed Winona's arm, pulling her back instinctively, both of them staring in horror at the structure shifting, sagging further under its own broken weight. Silas, get out of there, Tucker bellowed. A long, terrible moment passed. Then Silas emerged from the gap, soaked through, blood running from a gash above his eyebrow, a small, trembling calf clutched awkwardly against his chest. He'd barely cleared the opening when the rest of that section of roof gave way entirely, collapsing inward with a crash that sent dust and splinters flying even through the driving rain. Get to the house, Silas shouted, already moving. Now, all of you, go. They ran. The 4 of them, Silas with the calf, Winona, Tucker, Bo, staggered and stumbled their way back across the yard through wind that seemed determined to knock them down with every step, rain lashing sideways hard enough to sting like gravel, until finally they burst through the kitchen door into the relative shelter of the house, all of them soaked to the bone and breathing hard. Is everybody all right? Silas demanded, setting the trembling calf down near the stove, his eyes scanning the 3 of them with a fierceness that hadn't fully faded yet. Fine, Tucker gasped. We're fine, boss. You're bleeding. It's nothing. Silas wiped at the cut over his eyebrow with the back of his hand, smearing blood and rainwater together. What about the rest of the herd? Hands are still out there working it, Bo said. Figured this little one needed help first, the way it was trapped. Winona was already moving, some old instinct taking over even with her hands still shaking from fear and cold. She grabbed towels, started rubbing the calf down to warm it, while Tucker went back out to help with the rest of the herd despite the storm still raging outside. You're hurt, she said to Silas, glancing up at the cut still bleeding above his eye. Sit down. Let me look at that. I'm fine, it's just a scratch. Sit down, Silas. Something in her voice stopped him. He sat. Winona cleaned the cut as gently as she could manage with hands that wouldn't quite stop trembling, the adrenaline of the last 20 minutes only now starting to drain out of her, leaving something shakier and more frightened in its place. You could have been killed, she said quietly, not looking at him, focused entirely on the cloth in her hand. That whole section came down not 2 seconds after you got clear. Wasn't going to leave that calf trapped in there, Silas said. Couldn't have lived with myself if I had. And if you'd been a second slower. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone quieter, more thoughtful. Then I suppose I'd have been buried trying to save something helpless instead of standing here arguing with you about it. Not the worst way for a man to go, far as I can figure. Winona's hand stilled against his forehead. Don't talk like that. Just being honest. Well, don't, she said, and there was something raw and unguarded in her voice that surprised them both. Don't talk about dying like it's nothing, not after I just watched a barn fall down practically on top of you. Silas looked up at her, something shifting in his expression, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. The storm still howling outside the window, the small calf shivering by the stove, the two of them caught in a silence that felt heavier than it had any right to. I'm sorry, Silas said finally. Didn't mean to frighten you. You did anyway, Winona said, finishing with the cloth and stepping back. Frightened me plenty. She moved to check on the calf, needing somewhere else to put her hands, her attention, anything but the way Silas was still looking at her. Duds. The storm raged for another 2 hours before it finally began to break apart, the wind dying down to something almost gentle, the rain softening to a steady patter against the windows instead of that earlier violent assault. The other hands trickled back to the bunkhouse one by one, exhausted, soaked through, but accounted for, the herd mostly secured despite the chaos. The calf, weak and trembling when it first came through the door, slowly began to settle as the evening wore on. Winona had set it close to the stove, wrapped in dry towels, and spent the better part of an hour coaxing it to take warm milk from a bottle she'd fashioned out of necessity. Silas stayed nearby through all of it, occasionally helping hold the animal steady, mostly just watching Winona work with an expression she couldn't quite read. It's gonna make it, she said finally, as the calf's shivering eased and its breathing settled into something steadier. Weak yet, but it'll make it. Good, Silas said, and something in the simple word carried more relief than the word itself seemed to hold. They sat together near the stove afterward, the calf finally sleeping between them, the kitchen quiet except for the dying storm outside and the crackle of the fire. Winona felt the exhaustion of the day settling heavy into her bones. But underneath that exhaustion sat something else too, something that had been building for weeks now, something she'd been carefully avoiding looking at too directly. You scared me today, she said again, quieter this time, not an accusation, just truth laid bare. More than I think you understand. Silas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Can I ask you something? Go on. Why'd you run out into that storm? Could have stayed safe in the house. Nobody would have thought less of you for it. Winona considered this question, turning it over, trying to find an honest answer instead of an easy one. Because you were out there, she said finally. And the thought of you facing that storm alone, facing whatever was happening in that barn, without anybody else around, I couldn't sit still for it. Didn't even think about it, really. Just moved. That's a dangerous thing to admit, Silas said, voice low. Why's that? He turned to look at her fully then, firelight catching the planes of his face, the cut above his eyebrow already starting to scab over. Because it means you care what happens to me. And I find myself caring a great deal what happens to you, Miss Hale, more than I rightly expected to when I walked into your kitchen that first morning asking for a cook. Winona's breath caught somewhere in her chest. She looked down at her hands, rough and flower-worked, ordinary hands that had never once been called anything close to lovely. You don't mean that, she said quietly. I do mean it, Silas said. Wouldn't say it otherwise. I'm not a man who throws words around he doesn't intend to keep. Silas, let me finish, he said, gentle but firm. I've watched you for weeks now. Watched you work harder than any man on this ranch without ever once complaining. Watched you stand up to Dell without flinching, even though I could see plain as day how much it cost you to do it. Watched you run out into a storm that could have killed you, because you couldn't bear the thought of me facing it alone. He paused. I don't care what shape you are, Winona. Never have. Not from that first morning. What I care about is the woman underneath all of it. The one who feeds 11 hungry men without complaint, who comforts a frightened calf like it's the most natural thing in the world, who's got more strength in her than half the men working this land, and doesn't even seem to know it. Tears had started somewhere during that speech, slipping down Winona's face before she'd even realized they'd started, and she wiped at them roughly, embarrassed, unable to look at him directly. "You don't understand," she said, voice cracking. "My whole life, people have looked at me and decided who I was before I ever opened my mouth. Decided I was lazy or weak or not worth bothering with just because of how I look. I learned a long time ago not to expect anything different, easier that way. Hurts less when you don't let yourself hope for something better." "And what do you think now?" Silas asked quietly. "Sitting here, after everything that's happened these past weeks, do you still believe that's all you're worth?" Winona didn't answer right away. The question sat heavy in the room, heavier than the storm outside, heavier than anything she'd let herself confront in longer than she could remember. "I don't know how to believe anything different," she admitted finally, the words coming out small and raw. "I've spent so long telling myself I'm not worth somebody's kindness. Not really, not the lasting kind. People are nice to me sometimes, sure, polite, but the moment it matters, the moment somebody has to actually choose me over somebody prettier, somebody smaller, somebody easier to look at, I always end up the one left behind. Always have." "I'm not most people," Silas said. "You say that now. I mean it now, and I'll mean it tomorrow, and I'll mean it next year too, if you'll let me prove it to you instead of just telling you." He reached out, slow and careful, like he was giving her every chance to pull away if she wanted to, and took her hand in his. "Winona Hale, I have watched you feed every hungry man on this ranch, watched you comfort a dying calf back to life, watched you stand taller than men twice your size in courage, even when you didn't believe a word of what you were saying about your own worth. I think you are the strongest person I have ever met, and I am not interested in letting somebody that strong walk out of my life just because she spent her whole life being told she doesn't deserve to stay." Winona cried then, properly, the kind of crying that came up from somewhere deep and old. Years of accumulated hurt finally finding a crack to escape through. Silas didn't say anything else. He just held her hand steady and present, letting her cry without trying to fix it or rush her through it, until the tears finally slowed and her breathing evened back out. "I'm sorry," she said eventually, wiping her face with her free hand. "Don't know what came over me." "Don't apologize," Silas said. "Reckon you've been carrying that a long while. Glad it finally found somewhere to land." Outside, the last of the storm had faded into a soft, steady rain, the violence of the afternoon giving way to something calmer, gentler, the prairie finally settling after its fury had run its course. The calf slept on between them, small and warm and safe, proof that even the worst storms eventually passed and left something living behind in their wake. "Thank you," Winona said quietly, looking at their joined hands rather than at him directly, still not quite brave enough for that. "For saying all that. For meaning it, even if I don't quite know how to believe it yet." "You don't have to believe it all at once," Silas said. "I'm not in any hurry, Winona. Take whatever time you need. I'll still be here saying it, plain and steady, for as long as it takes you to hear it proper." She finally looked up at him then, something fragile and hopeful flickering behind her tear-swollen eyes, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Winona Hale let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like to actually believe she deserved something good. The fire crackled low in the stove. The rain softened further outside until it was barely more than a whisper against the windows. And in that quiet kitchen, with a rescued calf sleeping between them and the worst of the storm finally behind them, something had shifted between Silas Crow and Winona Hale that neither one of them was in any rush to name out loud, but both of them understood, in the marrow deep way a person understands the truest things, that whatever this was, it wasn't going away. The calf lived. Winona named it Storm, half as a joke and half because the name simply fit. And over the following weeks, the little creature grew strong enough to rejoin the rest of the herd, though it never quite lost its habit of trotting up to the kitchen door whenever Winona stepped outside, like it remembered exactly whose hands had pulled it back from the edge of dying. Something else had grown stronger in those same weeks, slower and quieter than the calf's recovery, but no less real. Silas found his way into the kitchen most evenings now, no longer pretending he needed a reason. He'd lean against the work table while Winona cooked, talking about the day's work, asking after her opinions on things he'd never have thought to ask a hired cook about before. Fence lines, breeding stock, whether it made sense to expand the herd come spring. "You're asking me about cattle now," Winona said one evening, amused, sliding a pan of cornbread into the oven. "Didn't realize my expertise extended past biscuits." "Your expertise extends plenty far as I can tell," Silas said. "Besides, man likes talking things through with somebody who'll tell him the truth instead of just agreeing because he signs their pay." "I'd tell you the truth regardless of who signed what," Winona said. "I know," Silas said. "That's exactly why I like talking to you about it." The teasing had a different quality to it now, something warmer underneath the words. And Winona found she no longer flinched away from it the way she once might have. There was still a part of her, stubborn and old, that woke some mornings convinced the whole thing was a misunderstanding about to correct itself. But that voice grew quieter with each passing week, drowned out slowly by the steady, unhurried way Silas kept showing up. Not just in grand gestures, but in small, ordinary moments that added up to something she was finally starting to trust. He noticed when she was tired before she said anything about it. He started splitting wood for the stove without being asked, leaving a stack by the door each morning so she wouldn't have to. When her hands cracked and bled in the cold, dry winter air, he showed up one evening with a small jar of salve he'd ridden into town specifically to buy, setting it on the counter without making any fuss about it. "Didn't need to do that," Winona said, turning the jar over in her hands. "Didn't need to," Silas agreed. "Wanted to." It was that simple distinction, repeated over and over in 100 small ways, that finally started wearing down the wall Winona had spent her whole life building. Not grand declarations, not dramatic gestures, just a man choosing her, quietly and consistently, day after day, in ways too small to argue with and too steady to dismiss. The other hands noticed too, of course. Word traveled fast on a ranch that small, and it wasn't long before knowing looks passed between Tucker and Russ whenever Silas lingered in the kitchen a little too long after supper, or whenever Winona's face flushed at some comment he made that wasn't even particularly worth flushing over. "Boss is sweet on the cook," Bo announced one afternoon, entirely too pleased with himself, while he and a few others mended fence along the south pasture. "Took you long enough to notice?" Tucker said, not looking up from his work. "Rest of us figured it out a month back." "You don't think it's strange?" Bo asked. Tucker straightened up, gave the younger man a long look. "Strange how? Man finds a good woman, decent and hard-working, who don't put up with his nonsense and feeds him better than he's eaten in years? Don't sound strange to me. Sounds like good sense." "Some folks'll talk," Bo said. Her being, different than what folks expect for a man like Crow. "Folks'll talk regardless," Tucker said, going back to the fence. "Always do. Questions whether a man lets that talk run his life for him, or whether he's got sense enough to know what's good when it's standing right in front of him." He glanced toward the house, where smoke was curling up from the kitchen chimney. "Boss has got sense, always has. Don't reckon that's changed just because folks in town might have opinions about it." Dell, working a few yards down the fence line, said nothing, though Winona had noticed he'd gone quieter in general since that night Silas had called him out at the table. He still wasn't warm toward her, not exactly, but the cruelty had drained out of whatever remained, replaced by something closer to wary respect. She supposed that was the best she could hope for from a man like Dell, and she'd decided somewhere along the way that it was enough. It was a Sunday evening, the kind with a sky gone soft gold and pink as the sun dropped low over the western pastures, when everything shifted into something neither of them could pretend was casual anymore. Winona had finished the supper dishes and stepped out onto the porch for a moment of quiet, watching the light change over the land, when Silas came around from the barn and found her there. "Evening," he said, climbing the porch steps. "Evening," Winona answered, making room for him on the step beside her, a habit so familiar now it didn't even register as anything but natural. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky deepen toward dusk, the cattle settling in the distance, the whole ranch easing into the particular stillness that came at the end of a long workday. "Been thinking about something," Silas said eventually. "That's so. Been thinking about it a good while, actually, longer than I probably ought to admit without sounding foolish." Winona turned to look at him, something in his tone catching her attention. "You're not usually a man who hems and haws over what he means to say." "No?" Silas agreed. "Not usually." He turned to face her fully, and Winona saw something nervous flicker across his expression, an uncertainty that looked unfamiliar on a man who carried himself with such steady confidence in every other part of his life. Winona, I've spent 29 years on this earth without finding a single thing. Not land, not cattle, not money, that I wanted bad enough to risk looking a fool over. And then you walked into my life 6 months back, flour on your hands and fire in your eyes, and turned that whole notion upside down. Winona's heart had started pounding hard enough she was sure he could see it. Silas, let me get this out, he said, gentle but urgent, before I lose my nerve entirely. He took a breath. I don't care what this town thinks. I don't care what gossip might travel through Larkspur Hollow or any other town within 50 miles. I have watched you transform this ranch from the inside out. Not just the cooking, though plenty of that too, but the whole feel of the place. Men who used to grumble through every meal now linger at that table because they don't want the evening to end. You've built something here, Winona, same as my father built this ranch out of nothing but stubbornness. And I find I don't want to spend another season of my life pretending I don't know exactly what that something is. He reached into his coat pocket and Winona's breath caught entirely as he pulled out a small ring, plain and simple, clearly handmade rather than bought from some fancy jeweler in a city she'd never seen. This was my mother's, Silas said, voice rough now. Only thing of hers my father kept, besides his memories. I had it resized last week when I rode into town for that salve. Wasn't honest with you about the whole reason for that trip. He held it out, hands not quite steady. Winona Hale, I am asking you, plain and without any pretty speeches I don't know how to give, to marry me, to stay here not as my cook but as my wife. Build something real with me, the kind of something my father built with nothing but bad luck and stubbornness. Except I think what we'd be building has got considerably better odds going for it. Winona stared at the ring, then at him, tears already gathering, though she hadn't fully processed what he'd asked. You don't mean that, she said, the old fear rising up fast and automatic. Silas, think about what you're saying. Think about what people will say. The most respected rancher in the territory, marrying his cook. A woman who looks like, I don't care how you look, Silas cut in, firm now, all the nervousness burning away into something fierce and certain. I have told you that since the first morning I walked into your kitchen, and I will keep telling you until you believe it clean through. I am not asking you to marry me despite how you look. I am asking you to marry me because of who you are underneath it. The woman who feeds the hungry without complaint, who stood up to Dell when nobody else would have dared, who ran into a burning storm because she couldn't stand the thought of me facing it alone. That woman is who I want beside me for the rest of my life. Everything else is just talk, and I've never once let talk decide what's right for me. What if they reject us? Winona asked, voice small. What if the whole town decides we're a joke, decides you've lost your senses marrying somebody like me? Then they're fools, Silas said simply, and fools' opinions never built a single thing worth having. This ranch wasn't built on what other people thought was wise. It was built on what my father knew in his own gut was right, even when half the territory told him he was a damn fool for trying. I know what's right, sitting here looking at you. Question is whether you trust yourself enough to know it too. Winona looked down at the ring again, simple and worn smooth with age, carrying inside it the whole weight of everything Silas was offering. Not just a marriage, but a kind of belief in herself she'd spent her entire life convinced she had no right to claim. I'm scared, she admitted, the words coming out raw and honest. Scared of wanting this so much and having it taken away somehow. Scared of believing I deserve it, and finding out I was wrong. I can't promise you nothing bad will ever happen, Silas said, taking her hand gently in both of his. Life don't work that way. Not on this land, not anywhere I've ever known. But I can promise you this, whatever comes, storm or drought or any other hardship this prairie throws at us, I intend to face it standing right beside you, not because I have to, because I choose to every single day for as long as you'll have me. The last light of the sunset caught the ring, the cattle lowing soft and distant in the gathering dusk, and Winona Hale, who had spent 28 years believing she was destined to watch other people's happiness from the outside, finally let herself reach for her own. Yes, she said, voice breaking on the single word. Yes, Silas. I'll marry you. He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that weren't quite steady, and when he kissed her, gentle, careful, like he was asking permission with every inch of the gesture. Winona felt something break open inside her chest that had been closed tight for as long as she could remember. Some old wound finally allowed to heal over into something stronger than it had been before. Okay. The news spread through the ranch fast, and faster still through Larkspur Hollow once the hands carried it into town on their next supply run. Just as Winona had feared, not everybody received it kindly. She heard the whispers herself the first time she rode into town with Silas, a few weeks after the engagement, to pick up supplies and visit the dry goods store. Women clustered near the church steps, voices dropping but not quite low enough, glances cast her way that she recognized from a lifetime of similar looks. "Can't imagine what he sees in her," one voice murmured. "Man like Silas Crow could have any woman in the territory." "Maybe he's lonely enough not to care," another answered. "Or maybe she's got him under some kind of spell, the way these things sometimes happen." Winona's face burned, the old shame threatening to swallow her whole right there on the street. But Silas's hand found hers, steady and sure, and he didn't so much as glance toward the gossiping women. "Don't listen to them," he said quietly. "Hard not to," Winona admitted. "I know, but they don't know you. Don't know the first thing about who you are, what you've built, what you've survived to get here." He squeezed her hand. "Their opinion don't put food on our table or build our future. Don't give it more weight than it's worth." It wasn't easy hearing that kind of talk follow her wherever she went in town over the following weeks. Old wounds, the kind she'd carried since childhood, ached fresh every time she caught a sideways glance or overheard a whispered comment. But each time Silas was there, not smothering her, not trying to fight every battle for her, just present, steady, a quiet reminder that his choice hadn't wavered no matter how loud the gossip got. Slowly, gradually, something else began to happen too. The hands at the ranch, who'd watched Winona transform their daily meals and their whole working environment over the past months, started speaking up in her defense whenever they caught wind of unkind talk in town. "She's worth 10 of those gossiping biddies," Tucker was overheard saying at the general store, loud enough to make sure it carried. "Woman's got more decency in her little finger than half this town's got combined." Even Dell, surprising everybody including himself, found himself defending her honor one evening at the saloon when a stranger passing through made a crude joke about Silas's choice of bride. "You don't know what you're talking about," Dell said, surprising the whole room into silence. "That woman feeds 11 hungry men every single day without complaint, stood up to better men than you when they tried disrespecting her, and saved a dying calf in the middle of the worst storm this territory's seen in years. You want to keep running your mouth about her? You can take it outside." Word of that particular defense made its way back to Winona within days, and something about hearing it from Dell, of all people, the man who'd once mocked her openly at her own table, settled something uneasy in her chest that she hadn't fully realized was still there. People could change their minds. Maybe, slowly, the whole town could too. The wedding itself was small, simple, exactly the kind of ceremony that suited both of them, rather than the grand affair some might have expected from the territory's most prominent rancher. They held it at the ranch itself, under the open sky, with the hands gathered around and a handful of townsfolk who'd come to care for Winona despite, or perhaps because of, everything she'd weathered to get there. Winona wore a simple dress, nothing fancy, nothing that pretended to be something it wasn't. And as she walked the short distance toward where Silas stood waiting, surrounded by cattle and dust and the wide, endless sky that had witnessed every hard day of her life leading up to this one, she felt something settle inside her that she'd never expected to feel. Not pretty, not exactly, but worthy, chosen, real. Silas watched her approach with an expression that left no room for doubt about what he felt. And when she finally reached him, when their hands joined together in front of everyone gathered to witness it, Winona Hale understood, fully and completely for the first time in her entire life, that she had finally found a place in this world where she belonged, not despite who she was, but precisely because of it. Marriage didn't smooth out the world the way Winona had half hoped it might, somewhere in the quiet corner of her mind that still wanted easy answers. The whispers in town didn't vanish overnight. A handful of folks kept their distance, kept their opinions sharp behind polite smiles, and Winona learned quickly that a ring on her finger hadn't transformed her into somebody those people suddenly approved of. It had just given her something steadier to stand on while she weathered them. What changed mostly was the ranch itself. The first winter, as Mrs. Crow came in hard and cold, the kind of season that tested every seam in a place, and Winona found herself running the kitchen with a new authority she hadn't quite expected to grow into. She wasn't just feeding hands anymore. She was managing supplies for a household that had to last through snowdrifts deep enough to bury a fence post, planning meals that stretched dwindling stores without anybody going hungry, training the two younger girls from town who'd come asking for kitchen work once. Word got around that Crow Ranch fed its people better than anywhere else in the territory. "You're running this place like a general," Silas told her one evening, watching her direct bow toward the root cellar for a fresh sack of potatoes, while simultaneously checking a pot and correcting one of the new girls' biscuit technique. "Somebody's got to," Winona said, not even glancing up. "You're too busy worrying about cattle to notice the pantry's down to half what it ought to be this time of year." "Wasn't aware that was my job to notice." "It's everybody's job to notice," Winona said, finally looking at him with that particular dry expression he'd come to love more than he'd ever admit out loud to anybody but her. "Ranch doesn't run on cattle alone, Silas Crow. Runs on people having enough in their bellies to get through a day's work without falling over." He didn't argue. He never did. Not about things like that. He'd learned, faster than most men might have, that the woman he'd married carried a kind of practical wisdom that made the whole operation better for having her steady hand in it, and he'd stopped being surprised by it months back. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it arrived generous, rain falling steady and warm instead of the violent storms of the year before, grass coming up thick and green across pastures that had looked half dead through the worst of winter. The herd grew. Calves dropped healthy, one after another, and among them, healthy as the rest despite her rough start, was Storm, fully grown now into a sturdy young heifer who still trotted toward the kitchen door whenever Winona stepped outside. "That animal thinks she's a dog," Tucker said one morning, watching Storm nose hopefully at Winona's apron pocket. "She remembers who saved her life," Winona said, scratching behind the heifer's ears. "Smarter than most folks, animals are. Don't forget kindness the way people sometimes do." It was true in its way, though Winona had to admit the people on Crow Ranch hadn't forgotten kindness either. Not anymore. The men who'd once mocked her at that table now treated her with a respect that had stopped feeling fragile or temporary, the kind of respect built slow over real time, rather than handed out cheap and meaningless. Dell, of all people, had become one of the steadiest hands on the property, the cruelty that once defined him replaced by something closer to quiet loyalty. "Never thought I'd say this," Dell told her one afternoon, helping haul supplies into the kitchen without being asked, the way he'd taken to doing more often. "But I'm glad the boss married you. Place runs better. Men work harder, knowing there's a good meal and a fair word waiting at the end of the day." "That's kind of you to say," Winona told him, and meant it. The old hurt from that first cruel comment about portions long since faded into something she could finally let go of entirely. "Wasn't always kind," Dell admitted, looking uncomfortable. "Said some ugly things back when you first came on. Never did properly apologize for all of it, not just that one time at the table." "You apologized when it mattered," Winona said simply. "Rest of it, I figure you've shown me plenty since then. Man's actions count for more than old words, far as I'm concerned." Dell nodded, looking relieved, and went back to his work. And Winona stood there a moment longer, struck by how much had shifted in less than a year, not just in how others saw her, but in how she'd slowly, carefully started seeing herself. The real test of everything they'd built came that second summer, when a dry spell settled over the territory and refused to lift for weeks on end. Creeks that usually ran steady through July slowed to a trickle. Grass that should have stood green and thick by midsummer turned brittle and pale, and cattle across the whole territory started showing the strain of it, ribs visible where good grazing should have kept them fat. Silas worked himself half to exhaustion trying to manage the herd through it, riding out before dawn and returning well after dark, his face growing more drawn and worried with each passing week as water sources dwindled and the grass kept failing. "We're going to lose stock if this doesn't break soon," he admitted one night, sitting heavy at the kitchen table, too tired even to eat properly despite the plate Winona set in front of him. "Other ranches in the territory are already culling herds just to keep the rest alive on what grass remains." "What do you need?" Winona asked, sitting across from him, her own worry plain on her face. "Wish I knew," Silas said. "Wish there was some simple answer. My father lost 2 herds to drought before I was even born. Always swore I'd find a way to manage it better than he did, and here I am, watching the same nightmare play out all over again." Winona reached across the table, took his hand the way he'd so often taken hers. "You're not your father, Silas. You've got resources he didn't have. Got people around you willing to work themselves raw, helping you figure this out. We'll find a way through it, together." It wasn't an empty comfort. Over the following weeks, Winona threw herself into the problem alongside him, using every bit of practical sense she'd built up, running a kitchen through lean times to help stretch what resources the ranch had left. She organized rationing for the household stores so more could go toward whatever feed the herd needed. She rode into town herself, despite the lingering coolness some folks still held toward her, and negotiated with the feed merchant for credit against the fall harvest. Using a combination of stubbornness and genuine goodwill, she'd built up slowly with the townsfolk who'd come to respect her over the past year. "Didn't expect you to be the one handling business matters," the feed merchant said, surprised, as she worked out terms that would have made a lesser negotiator blush at their boldness. "Lots of things about me folks don't expect," Winona said, signing the agreement with a steady hand. "Learned a long time ago that surviving hard times means using whatever strength you've got, wherever it happens to come from." The drought broke in late August, rain finally rolling in steady and welcome after nearly 2 months of punishing dryness, and though the herd had thinned some through the worst of it, Crow Ranch came through in better shape than most of its neighbors, thanks in no small part to the careful management Winona had helped orchestrate alongside her husband. "We made it," Silas said, standing on the porch with her, watching rain finally soak into ground that had gone hard and cracked through the worst weeks. "Don't know that we'd have made it half so well without you handling things the way you did." "We made it together," Winona corrected. "Same as everything else around here." It was around that same time as the ranch slowly recovered from the drought, and the herd began rebuilding itself towards something healthier. That word started spreading through the territory about Crow Ranch in a different way than it had before. Not gossip about an unlikely marriage anymore, but genuine respect for an operation that had weathered a brutal season better than most, run by a couple who'd built something solid enough to survive whatever the land threw at them. Neighboring ranchers, men who'd once raised eyebrows at Silas's choice of bride, started showing up at Crowland asking after Winona's advice on managing lean times, on stretching supplies, on the particular kind of practical wisdom she'd developed through a lifetime of making something out of very little. She found herself, unexpectedly, becoming something of a respected voice in a territory that had once looked at her sideways and found her wanting. "Strange thing," she told Silas one evening, sitting together on the porch the way they often did at the end of a long day, having folks ask my opinion on things, instead of just whispering about how I look. "Not strange," Silas said. "Just folks finally catching up to what I already knew about you from the start. Took them long enough. Took most folks a lifetime to learn that judging somebody by their size or their looks is about the most foolish way a person can spend their judgment," Silas said. "Some people never learn it at all. Lucky for us, the ones who matter around here eventually did." Winona thought about that a long while afterward, turning it over in her mind the way she once turned over old hurts. Except this particular thought didn't carry any sting to it. It carried something closer to peace. She'd spent the better part of her life believing her worth was something other people got to decide for her. A verdict handed down based on a glance, a measurement, a comparison against some impossible standard she'd never once come close to matching in anybody else's eyes. It had taken a ranch full of hungry men, a husband who refused to look away from her, a dying calf rescued in the middle of a violent storm, and a whole season of drought survived through grit and partnership, to finally teach her the truth she should have known all along. Worth wasn't something handed down by people standing outside a person's life, judging from a distance what they could never fully understand. It was built, slow and steady, the same way bread rose given enough patience and the right conditions, through work, through showing up day after day, even when nobody applauded for it, through choosing kindness in moments when cruelty would have been easier, through standing firm when the whole world seemed determined to convince a person they didn't deserve to take up space in it. Years later, Crow Ranch stood as one of the most respected operations in the territory, known not just for the quality of its cattle, but for something harder to name and rarer to find: a kind of decency that ran through the whole place, from the boss down to the newest hand, a culture built deliberately and carefully by two people who understood exactly what it cost to be on the receiving end of unkindness, and had decided, together, to build something different. Travelers passing through still remembered the warmth of that kitchen long after they'd moved on toward whatever destination waited further west. Word of Winona's hospitality had spread far enough that strangers sometimes went out of their way just to experience a meal at the Crow table, drawn by reputation alone, and every single one of them left fuller in more ways than just their stomachs. The hands who'd once mocked her cruelly at that first supper had become, in their own gruff and unsentimental way, fiercely protective of her. Tucker still brought wildflowers some mornings, an old habit grown into a comfortable tradition. Russ still fixed whatever needed fixing without being asked. Even Bo, grown into a steady young man with a family of his own now, still credited his time learning from Winona's kitchen as the thing that taught him patience and care he carried into every part of his life afterward. And Dell, gruff, complicated Dell, who'd once needed an audience for his cruelty and eventually found, slowly, a better use for his voice, became, against every expectation anybody might have held about him in those early days, one of the most loyal men on the ranch, the kind who'd defend Winona's honor without a second thought to anybody fool enough to bring up old prejudices in his presence. Whenever somebody new passing through made the inevitable joke that the great Silas Crow had married his cook, of all people, like it was some kind of curiosity worth remarking on, Silas had a standard answer he'd long since perfected, delivered with the same calm certainty he'd carried since that very first morning he'd walked into Winona's kitchen asking for help. Ranch can't survive on cattle and stubbornness alone, he'd say. Takes courage, too. Takes somebody who knows how to turn a simple meal into something that holds a whole community together. I didn't marry a cook. I married the woman who taught an entire ranch what it looks like to be decent to each other, day after day, without ever once asking for credit. Winona, for her part, had stopped needing anybody's validation to know her own worth, though she'd never quite lost the quiet humility that had defined her from the start. She didn't see herself as some grand symbol of anything, didn't think of her own story as particularly remarkable when measured against the harder lives plenty of other folks had weathered across that same unforgiving frontier. She simply understood, finally and completely, that the years of shame she'd carried had never reflected anything true about her, only the narrow, unkind judgment of people who'd never once bothered looking past the surface to see what actually lived underneath. She still baked bread most mornings before the sun fully cleared the horizon, flour settling onto her hands the same way it always had. The kitchen still the place where she felt most entirely herself. But she stood in that kitchen now without the old weight pressing down on her shoulders, without the constant bracing for judgment that had defined so much of her life before Crow Ranch. She stood there as exactly who she was, a woman who had built something lasting out of nothing more than hard work, honest kindness, and the stubborn refusal to let other people's narrow vision decide the shape of her own future. The frontier was a hard place, unforgiving in 1,000 small and large ways, quick to break people who weren't built sturdy enough to withstand it. But it had also, in its own rough and unsentimental fashion, given Winona Hale exactly what she'd needed all along. Not beauty, not approval, not the easy acceptance she'd spent a lifetime believing she'd never earn, but something far more valuable and far more enduring. A place where her work mattered. A man who saw past every surface judgment straight through to the steady, generous heart underneath. A community that had slowly, imperfectly, learned to measure a person by the quality of their character instead of the shape of their body. And in the end, standing in her kitchen on another ordinary morning, watching the sun finally clear the horizon over land that had become entirely her own, Winona Hale understood something she would carry with her for the rest of her days. That the harshest places in this world sometimes produce the deepest kindness. That genuine character, given enough time and enough courage to let it show, could transform not just one woman's life, but an entire ranch, an entire community, leaving behind something far more lasting than wealth or reputation ever could. It left behind proof that the people too often dismissed by a careless world were frequently the very ones strong enough to hold that world together, one act of quiet decency at a time.